Hey, how you doing, everyone? Thanks for joining us. We're going to talk a little bit today about stretching, improving mobility, and this is one of our first couple of live streams, so we're just working out some bugs. So we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about it. Anytime I talk about stretching, we talk about stretching for people that are in an injured state, which you'll see in the physical therapy clinic here. And then other times we're talking about people that just want to improve flexibility for sports, some achiness, aches or pains they might be experiencing. There's a variety of reasons why we're looking at injury prevention and, stretching and flexibility. And the research has kind of gone back and forth, as you've watched it through the years as a coach and as a therapist. There's been differences, and I recently did a little review of the literature and trying to get updated on what's some of the current thoughts, because it's changed for a while, and we just want to get a little sense of it. But what I first want to talk about is, like, what is our goal? What is our why? What are we trying to achieve by this? We really want to be fixated. Is it a particular sport? Is it specific to running that we're trying to look for improvements in? Are we looking at improvements in a sport that requires, let's say, lateral movement? Are we looking at something where we're just someone that's stiff when we're sitting and we just say, wow, we can improve some flexibility, maybe we'll feel a little less stiff after extensive periods of sitting and during the workday. And how do we achieve this? It's very hard, because I think in life, we sit a lot. Our society has changed a lot, where we've evolved into a society that sits for a variety of jobs. I always say I have the best job in the world. I'm constantly up and down. I'm talking to people. I'm maneuvering my body. I'm always moving, and I'm always circulating, the fluids in my body, and I'm moving things around. And I, for the most part, I really have the benefit of having a lot of motion just naturally in my life. And I think they've noted that there is some problems with one position too long. We talk about sitting, sitting being the new smoking. There's a lot of problems because we're shutting down for 8 hours a day. In fact, they had this one study that there was a big influence as far as cardiovascular wellness and things like that, because people that sat for 8 hours, even those people that did an hour of exercise at the end of the day. These are people that are very, very good exercise. They're getting that hour recommended exercise per day. They still had an increased risk. So how can we incorporate motion? So especially we're talking about stretching here, I really want to think about mobility and movement through the day. And I don't necessarily mean, stretching all day. I just mean incorporating a little bit of movement through our days, especially, and we'll talk about this at the end, and we take some of these ideas from this doctor, Dr. Kelly Starrett. He's a physical therapist. Great guy, really just talked about a variety of topics about neuromuscular connections and just really delved into that. He's got a book actually called the Deskbound, Standing Up to a Sitting World. And he's really looked at, standing and standing desks and how standing and really incorporating actually in the educational system, getting kids to stand up during school and some of the benefits. And I thought that's pretty fascinating, some things he's talked about. So we'll talk about that later in the talk. We're also going to talk about a few things as far as recommendations as far as flexibility, improving motion, and things we can do. A couple alternatives too of things that maybe, for those folks that have been stretching a lot, maybe they're not doing it enough. Maybe they're doing it too little. Maybe they're doing too much even. Or maybe stretching is not the key to their ache, pain, and whatever else is going on. So we have to consider that when we're talking about mobility and flexibility. So anyway, I do have in the clinic here numerous people that have been stretching for a while. A lot of my yoga instructors. I'll have someone that'll be suffering from chronic hamstring tightness and things like that. So these are people that are stretching a lot, and I'm sure they're stretching correctly or doing it via the yoga way. But something's missing there in that system, musculoskeletal system, that's not being achieved. So I think those are some things that, and we'll tell a story about that later on. So we're trying to tell you when's it, go through a couple things as far as when it's appropriate to stretch, what things go into it. What are we stretching? That's one of the big things. What are we really achieving with that? And I think some of the things we get caught up on the muscular elements, and we have to realize that there's also there's other things that we're stretching, and when we're trying to increase range of motion for a particular activity, or we have fascia, ligamentous structures. We tend to focus on particular muscle groups that go in a certain direction. We put pressure on those muscle groups to improve flexibility. And some of the thoughts is that we're really not increasing really the length of the muscle. We're actually improving the tolerance of the muscle. The actual extension or lengthening of the muscle belly is not what we're seeing. We're seeing a greater tolerance for improved range of motion. So that's something that we're looking at a little bit more, is we're getting less of that pain receptor, that feeling, that pain, and we're actually getting more mobility simply because we're improving tolerance and more of a central kind of pain receptor type issue. And it's allowing us to move without that. Just like muscle guarding, when we've had an injury, we're losing range of motion, we're getting that guarding sense, we're not allowing that joint to move. Some of that's what we're achieving when we're getting into those painful stretches. And the people that are really improving their motion and in doing that are really increasing their pain tolerance, and that's what's improving their flexibility. So there's different, in different ways. You can do focal stretching to a particular area, because I don't want to call it just muscle group. And then, which I love, what yoga incorporates, is looking at kind of like multi-segmental, flexibility and mobility. And I think sometimes when we're talking about mobility, it's good to kind of look at a segment, a particular area that's tight for you. See if we can improve that mobility in that area. If it's truly just a mobility issue, we just need to move, lengthening, improve tolerance for lengthening those tissues. And in other cases, I think looking at those, similar to like a squat, a compound movement for strengthening, we want to do a compound, stretch, multi-segmental stretching. So I really like the combination of those two areas. If you have one area that's kind of focally stiff, or having trouble with, looking at that. And there's certain classic areas that you have trouble in, like certain muscle groups that are classic for being a little tighter. And I think some of it has to do with how we move, and generally move through society, how we adopt certain movement patterns, and we get tight in very typical areas, okay? Because we're not moving into those areas as much as we are other areas. One thing I'll talk about when we talk about sitting is we're in a C society, so everything in the front gets a little tight, everything in the back kind of gets lengthened, and so we create that imbalance. So I think sometimes we got a combination of focal stretches that's working on a little hamstring, maybe a hip flexor tightness, and then we want to segue into maybe multi-segmental stretching along fascial planes, which are different from just muscles. Muscles cross certain areas. Fascial planes come in these different longer ranging and different patterns. So I do think yoga looks at that, these functional movement patterns in a way. And that's why some of the stretches we're going to talk about later on, I like to kind of put certain nuances. So we're hitting the movement patterns. The stretches aren't purely in one pattern of movement or one plane of motion. We want to look at them in multiple slight variations of position, because with life we're moving in slightly different movement patterns. So I think those are very important to incorporate those subtle changes to really improve, hopefully, your flexibility and your comfort. So those are some things we want to talk about, and we're going to talk about. So my main guidance and the main general recommendations for stretching is, in any area, we want to get a good sustained stretch around 30 to 60 seconds 3 times. And we really want to do it as a maintenance thing, something that's kind of like brushing your teeth, something you do every day, which is hard because it's hard to sustain that kind of pattern. How many people, they get up, they brush their teeth, they're in that habit. How can we create a habit of movement to create that doesn't become a chore and eventually is not sustainable? And we're going to talk at the end a little bit about some of those sustainable strategies. I think that'll help. There were some earlier studies on calf flexibility that looked at that 30-second being a magical number, 3 times for 30 seconds. And I think it was after 4 to 6 weeks we really saw a greater lengthening compared to shorter duration stretches. So if you are going to stretch, the hardest thing is getting to that 30 to 60 seconds. I put timers on people in the clinic here all the time, and they really struggle. It's really incredibly boring, and they really have a hard time getting that prolonged stretch. And that's why I use the timers on. I love with the smartphones now. We put a smartphone down. We said, you got 30 seconds, take a little pressure off, and then resume the stretch. You can vary it a little bit to kind of get that slight variation, whether it be a stretch over at here or here, slight variation to that mobility. So,
there's a question.
Yeah, so we've got a question on our Instagram account. What's the question?
Can stretching hurt you a lot more? Can stretching a lot hurt you more? Sorry.
Yeah, in certain cases, if you aggressively stretch, especially in the early post-injury stage, when you have a lot of swelling and such, that actually can be detrimental. You can actually have a reduction. You can actually irritate or prolong the healing, because you're taking these tissues that are essentially healing, taking a little sidebar here, healing, and we're stretching at that healing tissue too prematurely. What we do want is a little bit of gentle active motion after injury, but you can, at any time, you can aggressively stretch and hurt something, even in the short term. So yeah, that's a good question. So back to what we were talking about. So we're talking about 3 times for 30 seconds. What we like to think about is total time at end range. So we're trying to get that end range time. It's more applicable when we're talking about injury states, when we're talking about scar tissue adhesions and things like that, but also just in the non-injured state as well, okay? So prior to doing that, in a perfect world, which I know it won't always exist, if we can do that 5 or 10 minutes of a warm-up prior to the stretch, we get a little physiological warming, that 5 or 10 minutes. That'll typically warm up the tissues, get every kind of moving a little bit. Gentle walk, stationary bike, depending on what area you're focusing on. The walk's nice because you're getting a little bit of arm swing, a little bit of reciprocating gait and all that, and that's good for the upper extremity and the lower extremities. I do like that 5 or 10 minutes as far as a warm-up, and then going into the stretch. One thing that I originally said, I used to say was, as soon as you get done with your workout program, that's a great time to get some passive stretches in. And I've kind of changed my thoughts on that a little bit. If you've had a real intense, like a HIIT workout, a very intense workout, at that time where the muscles have really been traumatized a little bit and are, injured as they try and get a little stronger, that time may not be the time to go through a very vigorous stretching. So it's made me change my thoughts on that a little bit as far as the timing of it and when to do it. I was thinking we got this great warming. This is after a very intense workout. Why don't we do some very gentle passive stretches? I'm just saying that there's probably better times. I'm not saying it's the worst time, but I'm saying why don't we kind of think about doing it at a time when it's a little bit gentler. The tissues haven't been really beat up a lot, But let's not get too muscle focused. We're talking about the muscle, but we're also talking about other structures in that area too. So we always kind of focus on the muscle, but there's other things that are being stretched that we have to kind of realize are very important to stability and also warming up and stretching. So in the perfect world, that's what we want. Around 4 to 6 weeks, we're going to start seeing, hopefully, like we talked about, a greater tolerance for more motion. But I do believe that we have to really consider when we get this extra motion is really doing exercises in those new planes of motion. Because if we're truly going to use that new flexibility, if we're really appropriate for the sport, if we're talking about runners and we're in this plane of motion, I want to work on exercises that really get that strength in that new motion so we have that control in that motion that we're gaining. So I think that's a pivotal point that we have to look at, is that we have the flexibility, we got that bottom layer of range of motion flexibility, but we want to have that strength and control of that range of motion, really be able to use that motion. First came out of school, we're trying to get everyone to get this mobility, we're trying to get the range of motion out of the shoulder, let's say after shoulder surgery, and we're cranking on this arm and it's not very functional. The person only can get to right about here. We've got to pair it with some good strengthening and getting that strength in the full range of motion. So we want to consider that to complement any of our programs that we're considering that strength in a new available range of motion. And it can start with just active movement. So we have these passive static stretches, and then we have the active movement into the stretch. We reinforce that pattern of movement, and that can be part of like a dynamic warm-up. So we have passive stretches, which is our static stretching, which we're really talking about, which is just that prolonged static stretch where we're holding something, this is my finger, for 30 seconds, 3 times. Okay, and then after that, we want to reinforce it with some active movement, just to get into that, using that new available range of motion, and really let that our nervous system appreciate the new mobility and new planes of motion that we have available. So that is always something to reinforce, is that active movement, whether it being doing some light sprints and doing some progressive sprints, let's say working up to faster, greater range of motion, dynamic sprinting after we've done some mobility work for the hip flexors or hamstrings. We also then want to complement that. So those are some of the general things as far as, the magic word is, or magic time period is that 30 to 60 seconds. The current thoughts now on, and we'll show them some things later on, is that there's some downside to static stretching prior to doing a competition or an event or an activity, whether it be basketball, high jump, something that's very vigorous, explosive, that we lose some power, we lose some performance. As they look at the studies, it seems like the performance end, except at the very elite level, it's probably a very small margin. And what they are seeing is the static stretching at times they feel actually has some benefit for injury prevention. So we went through a period of time of probably banging and saying never do a static stretch prior to your competition. Avoid. And I've believed in that for a while, and I kind of thought it intuitively made sense. We traumatize the area a little bit by really vigorously stretching. But it seems to be more affected. It really affects the people more so in that very high-end elite. We're all talking our collegiate Olympic athletes that are right in the very edge. They're a couple seconds beyond someone else, or they're trying to make a half inch on a high jump, or whatever that may be. So we have to consider that it's probably more for that elite people. Also, the other thing that they were mentioning that I thought was very interesting, that the static stretching was part of an overall general warm-up, of a slight warm-up physically, going for a light jog, like a couple maybe half-mile warm-up, doing some dynamic stretches, some static stretches. So it's not in isolation. And I think, unfortunately, research, we look at things in isolation. A lot of these things, when they're combined with other things, we're not seeing the same downside effect, and I do, it kind of changes your thoughts with it. I used to tell people, if you really believe, prior to practice and all that, you really believe in the static stretching, to give a little bit of a buffer, maybe do some of your static stretching, let's say before a particular event, maybe 15 minutes before. But apparently the effects of this, the real benefits of the stretching is really for the first 30 minutes afterwards. You really get that real improvement. So we got to consider that maybe we don't want to, have that static stretching too far away from the competitive point to get the benefits of injury prevention and things like that. So it is evolving. If you want to be very conservative, doing a dynamic warm-up, which is just taking yourself through different warm-up patterns and movements, moving your joints in different positions depending on the sport. For lacrosse, for runners, we may not do as much overhead, movements as compared to lacrosse or football or some overhead sports, volleyball. Our dynamic warm-ups for our runners or other people may be a little bit different. So, and we'll talk about the dynamic warm-up and show a little bit of that later on. But it's basically just movements and taking yourself through different movement patterns, whether it be butt kickers, hip openers, Frankensteins, all these different dynamic warm-ups are some of the things that we'll do if we're really worried that the static stretches might be a problem. And do the static stretching maybe for other times, in your practice sessions, or other times if you just isolate your static stretching to other times. But I do think it kind of makes sense that we're probably, if the margin is this small, maybe we can do some static stretching if it really helps our athletes, and it seems like it opens up things for them and they need that. Maybe we have to make it more personal for the sport and with the person. So let's consider that with our stretching protocols. So also, when we're stretching, I want to really work on that breath. I want you to be able to kind of really relax and get into a state where we're really getting a decreased tone. We're not grunting and grunting and grunting. Is that a word? Grunting, and we're holding our breath and all that. I think we're not quite getting that nice elongation. So as you're doing these stretches and you're counting to 30, think about a rhythmical counting. Relax, let everything sink into those stretches, and hopefully really get to that full stretch. So really focus on your breath, relaxation, focus, and get that full benefit. So we're really sinking into that stretch and getting the full benefit. I can't tell you how many people, as they're counting, you can see they're tensing up, they're not moving. As soon as I say, okay, breathe in, breathe out, they start relaxing, they're feeling better, and all of a sudden they increase their stretch distance. And all it had to do with the fact that we're in tune with them being in a heightened state, heightened tone. Okay, it's like when I walk up to someone on a therapy table and we're about to do some passive range of motion together, some static stretching, and I walk up quickly and they're right after surgery or soon after, and they guard. They're nervous. You want to kind of talk, calm everyone down, talk to them what we're going to do slowly, and the same thing comes for yourself internally. Get yourself nice and relaxed. Okay, we're going to do some nice stretching, breathing. So it's some, you really want to get into it, get some nice music, mellow music, not heavy metal, and just kind of relax and get into that stretch and enjoy it. So, so those are some of the things as far as the timing, how you're doing stretching, the amount of time. We talked about getting that strength. So I think a big compliment we want to look at is really making sure we're not neglecting the strengthening aspect and thinking that all aches and pains are remedied by those passive stretches. That's something that I think is and when it's injured, we stretch it. When injured, we stretch it. And the strengthening part sometimes isn't appreciated as much, except, of course, you get into a rehab model and such. But strengthening is a big component. I have a lot of people that are I'll call them my cardio people, that they do a heck of a lot of stretching and a heck of a lot of cardio and a lot of what I call slow twitch endurance work. And they don't get into that strengthening component, and that missing element really helps them out when they embrace that. They get a little bit more stability, a little bit more strength in the motion they're trying to do, depending on the sport. Different sports have various benefits. They've seen that in like improving core strength and such, that people have actually improve their efficiency of movement as they have greater core strength. And that's kind of hip strength, even shoulder girdle strength and trunk strength. I think of the core as this whole, everything through this chain. Everyone thinks about just abs and core, but getting that whole chain mobility through the scapular, the shoulder region and the hip region, and also core, everything should be working. And hopefully that improves the mobility and contact and movement away from the body. So, as of one of the questions earlier, yes, obviously you can stretch something too much, you know, and you can get a delay. I'm much more worried about something that is something in weight bearing, an aggressive movement, but you can ultimately injure yourself in certain things. I think sometimes we're stretching, we're not stretching the segment we're talking about, the segment we're trying to target, and we get to work around that. So there's some compensations that some people do that I think are probably not really getting to the area that they think they're getting to. And it's hard to see yourself, you know, and whether you're really doing some of those compensations. So also, I think there are times when we're doing a general stretching, you know, exercise program, and we are, you know, we have an imbalance somewhere. You know, we have one area that's a little bit tighter, and as we stretch both sides improve mobility. And what eventually happens is we just have the same imbalance. And if we have one area that's a little tighter, why do we want something even looser, you know, that it is already? You were kind of contributing to that imbalance. I think sometimes the general kind of flexibility programs aren't great. We want to get to that balanced. You'll notice that, you know, after surgery, we really want a balanced shoulder joint. We want mobility on both sides before we really get into the strengthening component. If we just have one side that's tight, one side, the joint doesn't work well. And I want to think about if something's not balanced, I give the analogy of a dresser drawer. And as you're pulling it back, an old dresser drawer, you know, and all of a sudden it binds. One side we're pulling too much, one side is kind of jamming. We're kind of off our axis. Not that's it's just, you know, it's kind of off and it's kind of binding the joint and I think some of that probably occurs in our joints and in our structure that causes some of these problems. So we want to look at focal stretching the right structure at the right time. That's why sometimes getting an evaluation by a trainer or a therapist is really helpful to kind of look into the movement patterns, how you squat, how do you go up and down steps, and you can see these patterns in certain things that people favor, and also teaching them after we get that flexibility to achieve that new movement pattern similar to strengthening in that new range of motion. So, so those are some of the things that we want to talk about. So what is a dynamic? So we talked about dynamic warm-up, static. One of the things I've noticed is there are the people that are really concerned about static stretching, that real passive stretch before competition. There's some interesting work on the foam rolling on various areas and instituting foam rolling. And they see that the first 5 minutes, like you were just about to do something, let's say a quick, like a very quick, let's say high jump or movement pattern, rolling out just a few, there's a little bit of effect of 5 minutes and doesn't have the potential downside, you know, in our real high end sports, a real explosive sports, doing some foam rolling in the structures that you're concerned about kind of helps loosen up in a very temporary basis and doesn't have the potential ill effects of static. So with our foam rollers, I think that there's some advantages to that and doing maybe some soft tissue work if you're having some areas that you can't relax, or even some deep breathing, you know, some breathing, or on one of my earlier videos, you'll see on box breathing or square breathing, kind of reducing that tone, resetting, you know, bringing that tone down a little bit also is kind of helpful as well. So consider the foam rolling as another option in the particular areas you're working on if you're worried about the static stretching giving you a trouble prior to, like I said, prior to an event, like immediately into it. Like say you're a track star, you're trying to do a high jump, doing the foam rolling ahead of time may be a nice complement and something that has a less of a potential downside before you do that particular sport. So consider that. When this came out, I thought that was an interesting, you know, we didn't give up on the stretch at all. We're getting some kind of soft tissue work going on, but we're not, you know, just going in cold. So consider that. So let's go over a couple of just quick stretches. We're going to do some of the ones that we will commonly see, and just some common things. Some of the people that are very active, and you know, this will be kind of rudimentary stuff, but we're going to talk about that. And then lastly, I want to talk about our desk program, which is really stolen from stolen is a nasty word, borrowed from Dr. Kelly Starrett. I think there's something to it. I've incorporated in some of the things I'm doing in life and really helping with mobility. So let's go through a couple quick stretches here. I'm going to move back the camera a little bit, and we'll adjust this for everyone. Okay, we're going to come down a little bit.
Don't move that chair.
Nope. Okay. All right, so one of the stretches we want to consider here, okay, can we tip that down, Ryan? Just a little bit. Okay, good. Up a little bit further. We're just going to adjust that. Thanks for being patient. Okay, a little bit. That's good, Ryan. So if we want to stretch the front of the groin right here and kind of work on what to consider like a hip flexor stretch, we want to essentially tighten our abdominals here, and we want to kind of tug in so we're not stretching our lower back and such. We want to kind of drive our hip forward. Good sustained stretch, nice and upright. Okay. You see a lot of people kind of sinking into the stretch and they're missing. We're kind of getting some of this, but we're kind of getting more of a lower back stretch. So we're coming up, tighten here, so you're kind of neutral. Little arch here, tighten here, and then rock forward. And that's more of a hip flexor stretch. Some of the things I like to nuance is changing the angle a little bit. So we'll go back a little bit further here. Angle, so I work on a little turning out with our heel here, turning in as we're going into that stretch. We're going to hit different aspects of the hip flexors. Not all our motion is one plane of motion. We're pivoting, we're turning onto our girdle. And I would say this is one of the biggest stretches people kind of don't do correctly and kind of rush through. Some of the things we can incorporate is kind of incorporating some of the yoga kind of components. And then once we have this down, maybe even doing some overhead stretches like this, kind of moving into the upper back, maybe releasing the stretch position a little bit. So now we're getting hip and also lower back kind of combined stretches. So that's why I think if you work on some focal areas in addition to some compound movements, compound stretches, I should say, it's a nice complement. Another stretch that I think, we're always stretching our hamstrings. One of the things with the hamstrings is really getting into the right structure. Are we stretching the lower back? Are we stretching the hamstring? You see a lot of people, they'll kind of do this combined stretch. Coming forward, let's try it on this side. Coming forward and down like this. And they're stretching a lot of lower back, and they'll tell them, they say, I'm not feeling a lot here, but I'm feeling a lot down in this lower back area. That might be the limitation. But if our goal is to really work on hamstring flexibility, we want to kind of tuck in, similar to the other one, lock in our trunk and kind of pivot and hinge at that point. Hinge into that structure, chest forward. Just to make sure we're not losing track of where we're trying to stretch. Listen, if you're trying to stretch the lower back and the hamstring at the same time, go for it. Bring yourself forward, come down like that. If we're really trying to isolate one segment that seems a little tighter on you, or we want to improve, and like we said, improve the tolerance for the stretch, our pain capacity, we may want to come forward like this. All right. So we're really going to kind of target this area here. We talked about the hip flexors. Back here, I want a common area that you'll notice a lot of people have difficulty with, and I'll show it in more of a standing. If we can move that camera up a little bit, just tilt it up for me. Good. One of the ones you'll see that a lot of people, they may have some loss of motion here, but as we sit down, we tend to lose this backward motion. So I would say the third stretch we like to emphasize is that lower back arch or extension stretch. We'll start out sometimes if someone's very sensitive by just doing some 1 or 2 second holds and a release for a series of 30. And then as we get better and we're holding it for longer periods, we can either do it on the ground, we can do a prop where you prop up on your elbows on the ground, creating that stretch, or even just a sustained stretch for 30 seconds on your stomach, or standing. It matters your preference, but there's many ways to kind of skin a cat. So those are 3 of the ones. Just incorporate basic principles of that 3 times for 30 seconds. And then, that should really help you kind of get that improved tolerance right out in that 30-second to 60-second time period. So, all right, so we're going to bring everything in a little closer here. One of the things that I think, how do we improve that mobility and make it part of our day? Make it something that we are always going to kind of incorporate, we're always going to have, and also improve our comfort with sitting, which is a big issue. We deal with a lot of people with spine issues in the clinic here. And one of the things that I think is great is, one, incorporating a standing desk. And I'm not saying you have to stand the whole time. You can actually balance it with standing compared to sitting, okay? But changing that throughout the day, maybe try like the morning is the standing, the sitting is in the afternoon, or even various on the hour. But even more importantly than that is changing different positions. I do talk about the perfect ergonomic setup. But I think that's helpful in the acute stage of a back pain, let's say, or certain things. But what I do think is finding different positions that you can do throughout the day that can be very helpful. So what I mean by that is constantly changing position. The best posture to achieve is the best posture for anyone is the next one you move to. And what I mean by that is a little bit of movement and fidgeting, almost an ADD thing, fidgeting. It's like, man, I just can't stand still. But in the sitting position, it's adopting different postures. So we're going to take this camera, bring it a little higher. So my cameraman Ryan's going to hold this for me, my son. And we're going to he's going to toggle so you can see me in different positions. So, if you're sitting, if you're standing right here and you got a standing desk, using your foot forward. Okay, let's go back a little bit, Ryan.
I need to guide me because I can't really see.
That's right. So one of the things you can do is kind of bring your foot up like this on the edge of the desk, get a little step stool, incorporate different positions. Some of the desks you can work on on a stool, let's say, kind of maintaining like a little bit of a turnout position. Also adopt if you're sitting down, you're in the seated position, let's say. I'll just take that out of the stand. You can even just work on working on some change in position, work on a little turnout while you're at the desk. Work on kind of leaning forward a little bit.
I'm gonna flip the camera, sorry. Okay.
So these are some of the things you can work on, kind of sitting like this, working on a little typing like this, and constantly kind of adopting slightly different positions, okay? This works better for something that doesn't have armrests and such, and armrests serve another purpose. They can help you with taking some pressure off your back, but varying those positions. Coming in and just working on coming up into the desk into kind of more of an outright position like this. Obviously not everyone can get into these positions right away. I'm not suggesting this is for everyone, but I'm saying you can slowly change the positions you adopt. Standing desk, like maybe taking that conference call, get a little upright, a little typing at your standing desk. You're varying your position. You're constantly kind of moving around. And one of the great things is they find the amount of calories you expend in sitting is like 300 for the day, and standing is 1,000. So what a benefit. You got a little extra caloric burn. There's a little bit more focus in the standing, incorporating a standing desk. And if you can't tolerate the whole day because of other joint issues, it may not be appropriate for you. But what we want to do is change the variety, go to more of a wider stance when we're standing there. Constantly changing and adapting to these subtle changes in positions, I really believe is the key to just maintain that mobility through the day. At the end of the day, feeling less stiff, feeling more energized, feeling more mobile. So I think that I'll call it the desk routine, which I'll put on another video, I think is something that is powerful, because whether it be at a desk or, most of us are sitting down, unfortunately, for a large portion of the day. How can we incorporate some movement that we don't feel like we've sectioned off another part of our day for mobility work? So I do think there's something to that. I give Dr. Starrett full credit for that. I think he really is onto something. Providing some nutrition for the body by different positions, okay? And we are meant to move, and we can't all move just in that hour in the gym at the end of the day or at the start of the day. I think we have to think about how we can get those movements in besides just taking the stairs instead of taking the elevator to work. I mean, that's a good start. I think that's a mindset, but I think thinking about different positions that you can incorporate, even a kneeling position. You're at a desk, you kind of kneel down, do a little work like that, work on a little bit of a turnout position when it's appropriate. I do think that you combine some of these subtle positions as far as even like yoga stretches, or you can really get that mobility and not even really feel like you sacrificed more time from your day. I'm trying to take something that still retains the time of day for your kids, doing other things that you want to do. I think as a physical therapist, we kind of get so focused on our own selves and that everything's got to be about health and wellness. We forget about the importance of, we don't think about that there's other things in the day that get in the way of wellness and health. So how can we incorporate that? So anyway, I hope this video helped you out. I think we covered most of what we wanted to cover. And some of it is focused on stretching, but I think incorporating this mobility and this kind of movement throughout the day will make your mobility work even better. So if you like this, please subscribe. If any other comments, please place a comment in there. And if you like it, or share it with someone, share it with someone that might have some concerns. And reach out to the clinic if you have any mobility or want an evaluation of some things that you're having some trouble with. We want to keep you moving here, especially with all the stress with COVID. I want you guys to keep moving and not be stuck inside as much as possible. All right, have a great day.